Just add masks and sanitizer and hold the I voted stickers. Welcome to those listening on 89.7 GBH Radio and to those watching through our social media channels, whether it's GBH News on Facebook Live, on Twitter, or on YouTube. And that includes our special guests who reserve seats in our virtual studio this evening on Zoom. We look forward to your comments and questions as part of our special live coverage that starts now.
I'm here to announce that I'm going to be a candidate for the United States Senate.
America can't wait. Justice must be delivered. During this time of COVID-19, of economic and public health crisis, you missed over 50% of the votes. When I stood next to Bernie in 2017, introducing Medicare for all, Congressman Kennedy took 2 years.
Congressman Neal has voted for budgets that have given Stephen Miller and Donald Trump and his administration the funding they need to separate children at the border.
It's also about showing up to cast these votes, Mr. Mayor. You're talking about me when you couldn't make it to school committee meetings.
We should have predicted that some communities would have been hit harder.
I started this campaign 217 days ago.
I am running for Congress with the fierce urgency of a mom fed up by what is going on in this country.
Over 50% of the police officers that I've hired look like and speak the language of the vast majority of our community.
My position on these issues precedes my time in Congress. I started affirmative action in the city of Springfield during my time as mayor.
Is your father funding that super PAC that is attacking me right now?
No clue, no idea.
What can your country do for you? What can your country do for your family?
Just a taste of what we've lived through together over the past year. The speeches, the debates, the endorsements, and the tweets. Now it's decision time. Election officials across the state are now counting votes. From the Senate race to the offices in your local town, including a sizable number of mail-in votes that could take longer than usual to tally. Over the next hour, we'll be joined by some of the best minds in Massachusetts politics, including Suffolk University pollster David Paleologos, political analyst Erin O'Brien from UMass Boston and the GBH political team, Adam Riley, Peter Kadzis, and Soraya Wintersmith. Later, we'll get an update on turnout and find out how things went at the polls from our own Mary Blake. So I'd say we're in good hands tonight. As I mentioned, if you're with us on social media, we welcome your comments and questions, as that will also be part of our program. So let's get to it. We start this evening with GBH's senior political editor, Peter Kadzis. And as I mentioned, political analyst Erin O'Brien from UMass Boston, who've helped us understand the gyrations in this campaign, the ins and outs over months and months. Good evening to both of you. We'll start with the big kahuna tonight. That's the Senate race, Kennedy versus Markey. It's not often we go into a night like this with a nationally watched race, a longtime incumbent, and a Kennedy, still a good deal of uncertainty. Erin, it was a campaign interrupted by the pandemic. There was not a lot of retailing until the end, not a lot of polling until fairly recently. Is there a front runner in this race?
It's Ed Markey. Who knew? I mean, 2020's upside down, and the Massachusetts Senate primary is performing very 2020. You know, a lot of analysts, including myself, thought when Kennedy entered the race that name recognition, that legacy would really carry the day. And Ed Markey has game, who knew? And has really mobilized people, used social media effectively, got young people involved. And I actually think, you know, it helped him. You know, Joe Kennedy's good at retail politics. Ed Markey isn't bad, but not as good. So I think that ended up being a positive. I mean, of course, he doesn't want the pandemic, but it ended up being a positive for that race.
So there are some people allowing for some surprises here, Peter. And by the way, we may not know the outcome of these races tonight. I just want to warn everybody about that. The conventional wisdom, though, Peter Kadzis, is the race will be decided in the cities, here in Boston and Worcester and Springfield and so on, by people who did not necessarily vote by mail, in many cases from disenfranchised communities. Does that still feel true to you? And make sure you unmute yourself so we can hear you on Zoom.
Very good point. Good point about unmuting. I don't know, Joe. I mean, elections in Massachusetts have traditionally been, ever since Michael Dukakis was first elected governor, have largely been decided by the suburbs. Now, I think the cities allow for the surprise element. If Kennedy pulls it out, it will probably be because of the cities. I've got to tell you, though, that I right from the start thought that Markey would win, but I thought he'd win by the narrowest of margins.
How come?
Largely because my gut told me that the Kennedy name didn't have the magic it once had.
Well, that's a big part of the story, isn't it?
It is. And I think especially in the age of Trump, we tend to take political dynasties for granted here in Massachusetts. We've had the Adamses, we've had the Lodges, we've had the Kennedys. Now, whatever happens tonight doesn't mean it's the end of Joe Kennedy's career. And I want to be careful that I don't, make it sound like he's definitely going to lose. I will say, though, that on the positive side, Markey has run a very, very good campaign. And the hero of this election may be his campaign manager, if he wins, John Walsh. John Walsh is a guy who took someone no one had ever heard of by the name of Deval Patrick.
That's right.
And beat the pants off the Democratic establishment. Just sitting in my kitchen here in Jamaica Plain, I can tell you that our household has been touched 5 times by telephone calls from Markey, 2 calls aimed at separately my 21-year-old son. In the last week, I've seen a small flourishing of yard signs, all for Markey in the neighborhood. And very surprisingly, because our household votes, if there's a dog catcher on the ballot, everyone in my house goes out to vote. And we've yet to feel the touch of the Kennedy campaign.
Boy, that is really hard to believe.
I live right on the JP Roxbury border.
Yeah.
So if the urban vote is supposed to come out for Kennedy, they certainly missed the Kansas household.
Despite all the lit drops and all the get out the vote efforts over the last couple of weeks, Erin O'Brien, how do you read into that? And are you not allowing for a surprise tonight? You feel like this is pretty well?
Anything can happen tonight. We say that with a wink and a nod normally. I mean it this time in the sense that we have never had 2 popular incumbents. Now, obviously, Kennedy's the challenger. Similar ideologically, forget what you've heard, they're similar ideologically. And we have never seen, and Markey has no ethics issue. Usually if it's an intra-party challenge, the other candidate is wounded in some way or they're coming from a different ideological bent. So all bets are off here. We don't have any predictive models to say, in past races like this, there have been no past races like this. The sort of right now people are saying older people are going for Kennedy, younger people are going for Markey. That could fall apart tonight because we don't know who decides to turn up at the polls. Polling this race is extraordinarily hard. I know Pollster's on later and I'm sure he'll tell you the same thing because you have to predict voters without any models of an election like this. How do you model who the likely voter is, who the Kennedy voter is, if we've never had a race like this? So, I mean, we always say turnout matters, but I think it's really hard to say, the suburbs or urban. I know a lot of households that are basically canceling each other out tonight. One voted for Kennedy and one voted for Markey. So I'm fascinated to see the exit polls. I had sort of hypothesized that it might be the case that people didn't turn out. I'm surprised that Kennedy never really paid for making us do all this during a pandemic. And a lot of Democratic voters, not us and the lovely people who joined the Zoom, don't care that much. A lot of Democratic voters are like, Kennedy's good, Markey's fine. So if you don't care that much, I had sort of thought there might be a breakage effect. Why bother? Why bother turning out? Mail-in balloting. I think there's a danger that we could overgeneralize from this race about Markey, about the Kennedy legacy. We've never run a primary like this during a pandemic, and I hope we never do it again. But it's I'm not sure what lessons we're going to be able to take from this beyond, is the moderate wing ascendant or is the progressive wing ascendant?
You're listening to special live coverage on Massachusetts primary night here on GBH Radio and online as we gather some smart people like Erin O'Brien, like Peter Kadzis, in a big panel that's going to follow for the rest of this hour. That's right, Erin. And she didn't send me a check for that either. And we also have a whole bunch of people inside our Zoom virtual studio, and they're already asking questions and leading me to one I wanted to bring up. And that's, of course, the impact of mail-in ballots and overall turnout. We're all sitting at home. We're watching the news, I guess, getting involved to a large extent. And then suddenly something shows up in the mail to make it even easier. Ellen is asking, please talk about turnout. Give us some context, because Peter, Kansas, we could have the highest turnout, according to Bill Galvin, the Secretary of State, in about 20 years.
Yeah, he's projecting as high as 1.5 million.
So what's the impact of that? Is that advantage Kennedy? We can both take a swing.
No. I mean, I'm not sure we know. I mean, see, one thing that makes this race so tricky, not just the Kennedy race, but all of the primaries going forward, the ideological differences are scintillant. I mean, Erin alluded to that. You know, if every candidate on the Democratic congressional primary was running in Kansas, every single one of them, even Steve Lynch, would be branded a communist. I mean, the ideological similarities are remarkable. So I think it's very, very hard to guess. Now, tomorrow, I'll be telling you exactly what this means.
And I'll say, Peter, were you surprised? Of course not. Erin, does a high turnout, and does the impact specifically of mail-in ballots make a different game here?
Well, heck yeah. I mean, we've never done mail-in balloting. I mean, we obviously, Colorado, other states have done it. But if we have high turnout, I'm a political scientist. That is good news for democracy. We made it easier for voters to turn out. And I'm really glad we're doing this in the primary first. You know, anytime you get a new car, it's harder to drive. You get a new device, so there's some mess ups. So I'm glad we're doing it in a primary where, you know, the two parties, the loser and the two parties won't say it's because of mail-in balloting. Mail-in balloting has the potential to really increase turnout. That's good news for this democracy, and I think it's good news for the Commonwealth. There will be hiccups, and I think there's a danger in saying, oh, there were a couple mistakes, so mail-in balloting is problematic. There's mistakes in every election. But they're human errors of well-intentioned people trying to get others to exercise the franchise. So, you know, and I'll also say the research shows us that mail-in balloting can decrease inequality in turnout, and that has implications for social policy. States that have lower inequality and turnout between the affluent and the poor get more affluent social policy. So it's just not a feel-good democracy thing. It has policy implications that I personally am hoping to see in the Commonwealth.
Peter, I'd like to pick up on something that you pointed out to us, because we need a reminder sometimes what's really happening here. This is a primary, and voters in Massachusetts are carefully choosing between which hue of blue they want to vote for tonight. There's massive overlap with these two candidates, and no one is talking about the fact that there's a Republican primary here. Whoever wins this, Joe Kennedy, Ed Markey, will run against a Republican, and they can't get arrested, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame, because I'm now old enough to remember the days when there was a vibrant and sometimes dominant Republican Party.
Well, let's name Shiva Ayyadurai and Kevin O'Connor, right? One of these guys is going to run in this race against a Kennedy or a Markey.
And it's going to be a largely futile, it'll be a futile effort. Even if Trump were to get behind them. And by the way, most candidates Trump backs wins. That wouldn't be the case in Massachusetts. It's really a shame. It makes Charlie Baker's election seem that remarkable. But again, if you use my Kansas test, Charlie Baker would be a conservative Democrat in Kansas.
All very true.
The Republican Party in Massachusetts is in chaos. Do they want to be the Charlie Baker wing? That's the one that's been the most successful, especially when it comes to winning the executive office, the governor's office. Or are they going in the Trump model? There's the party itself, the party organizers, not necessarily voters, have embraced that the Trump model, I think, to their electoral disappointment. But nonetheless, we talk a lot about the moderates versus the progressives, and sometimes myself included forget that attention is being played out in Massachusetts Republican Party politics as well.
Just so everyone knows, coming up, we're going to be talking specifically with Adam Riley about the candidates in the 4th congressional race, because whether Joe Kennedy wins or loses tonight, someone has to take that seat. That's a very crowded field, and it's one that deserves its own segment. We'll talk more about that. If you guys have front runners there, you can certainly interrupt me and let me know. But while you're both with us, Erin O'Brien and Peter Kadzis, I'd like to ask you about District 1. This is really another very important race, not just here, but nationally. Richard Neal, longtime congressman in Western Mass, is chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. Not every state gets one of those, and he's going up against a young mayor named Alex Morse. This is another interesting one. There's been a lot of drama and even scandal in this race, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, here we have, in many ways, the most important of all the congressional races, because the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee has real power. And when you add Richie Neal to Jim McGovern in neighboring Worcester, who's head of the Rules Committee, you've got a very powerful duo in Washington, D.C.
So powerful, Charlie Baker got involved to endorse the Democrat Richard Neal. Helps to have friends in Washington.
Just a few days before, described himself as a pragmatic Republican. And there's nothing more pragmatic than endorsing the guy who funnels a lot of the money that comes into Massachusetts this way. This race is the classic regular Democrat incumbent Neal, versus progressive challenger Mayor Morse. And, I would say that after the Markey-Kennedy race, this is the race that'll be closely watched around the country. As a matter of fact, in the last several nights watching various cable news networks, Massachusetts has gotten an awful lot of national attention.
That's for sure. I've seen a lot of cable news crews around here today. The New York Times spent the weekend with the candidates in the Senate race. As far as this one goes, though, Neal versus Morse, Erin O'Brien, does that mean, does Ways and Means, does that element of influence mean anything to people who aren't political wonks? Does that help Richard Neal keep his job?
No.
Okay.
No, on the face of it. But I was out in Western Mass a lot the last couple of weeks. Once voters understand what Ways and Means is, it's pretty simple. He brings you a lot of stuff, brings you a lot of goodies. That's why Charlie Baker, he's smart. He picks up the phone. Richie Neal helps him and makes Charlie Baker look better because it looks like he's delivering on promises. And so I think, he's not just an institutional Democrat, an old school Democrat that a lot of progressives have issue with. Once you explain institutional power, Ways and Means, I do think it has, voters don't want to lose that. I like being in the front of the line. Getting a new person and moving to the back of the line doesn't really appeal to me, even though I might think the back of the line guy is a little cooler.
Yeah, we should note that chairmanship is not transferable, even if you beat the chair.
Yeah, and that's just it. Congress is a seniority system. It's loosened a little bit with sunshine rules of the 70s, but Congress is hierarchical, and there's a lot of ambitious politicians there. That Richie Neal has a lock on that committee. Many observers think it would be a mistake to lose that. Why give up that kind of institutional power, especially when we've got the 2020 census coming up? And, who knows if Massachusetts loses yet another seat.
Well, this is all fascinating stuff, and these two races have something in common, as we're talking about the younger progressive going up against the long-term incumbent. Of course, Markey is very much a progressive as well, but you're talking about Ed Markey, 47 years in Congress. And in the case of the other one, Alex Morse has basically been alive for as long as Richard Neal has been in Congress. But you can both, before we move along and focus with Mary Blake on our turnout today, take a swing at this. These are not Ayanna Capuano races, correct? This is not AOC, or is it? Because people have been pretty confused about this. assuming that a young insurgent can knock down a long-time incumbent, Peter Katzis?
Well, I think AOC is sui generis. I mean, she's a political thoroughbred. She's a figure in her own right. She shines such a powerful beacon that it tempts us all to interpret races, in her shadow.
Mm-hmm.
There is, however, an element of that dynamic there. I mean, Morse can't hold a candle to AOC, but nevertheless, the progressive forces, currents that he represents are very similar to what happened there. He just doesn't have the charisma. And it won't be the big surprise that she was.
You remember, Erin, when it was danger zone to be an incumbent. It doesn't feel that way.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of challengers. Stephen Lynch has challengers, legit challengers. Seth Moulton has challengers. So, yeah, you do have a bit. I think you do have a bit of a mark on your back. And one thing we haven't talked about the race, though you definitely alluded to it, Joe, that this race has a little Days of Our Lives element to it, a little soap opera going on there. And I don't mean to make light of the issues, but the accusations from the college Democrats that Alex Moore, and then to find out maybe these were disingenuous. I actually hold, I think, a minority opinion that I do think. I'm a college professor. I do think it's problematic that you're dating students on campus, and that's not out of heteronormativity. That's out of the idea that you're in a position of power on campus.
Yeah.
That's not an argument I feel like I've heard enough. He didn't do anything wrong. There was nothing in his contract that said he couldn't do that. But I do think, some voters have rallied to him, and other voters sort of feel like, if you can't quite decide between Richie Neal and Alex Morse, that element is there too. I mean, date whoever you want, but don't date a student, even though there was never an accusation that the student was in his class. But I think that's
correct.
Power. So I had to get my poli-sci plug, professor plug in on that one.
I'm glad you did. This is what you do, and you have a unique perspective. Erin O'Brien and Peter Katzis, we're going to wrap this up with some numbers, all right? We're talking about Richard Neal versus Alex Morse, District 1. We now have 20% of precincts reporting at this hour. Richard Neal is leading 61% to 39%. Wow. And with regard to the Senate Democratic primary, again, 20% of precincts reporting Joe Kennedy is leading right now, 52% to Ed Markey's 47%. This is very early, and we just tell you this because it's interesting to watch the momentum and some of the ebbs and flows over the course of the evening. These numbers will likely change a lot. Peter Katzis, GBH News, senior political editor, and Erin O'Brien, poli-sci professor, and our friend here at GBH News who helps us analyze the ins and outs of all of this madness. Thank you both for being with us in our special live coverage here on.
I love being here on primary night.
It's the best. This is what
Take care, Joe.
Thank you, guys. We're going to bring in Mary Blake coming up next because this was a big part of the story today. Of course, turnout, right? Something we talked about a lot, the impact of mail-in ballots and against the backdrop of a pandemic. This is where things get interesting. Of course, they were socially distancing. They were handing out masks. They were giving sanitizer to people in line, waiting to vote. Are you with us, Mary?
I certainly am.
From the GBH newsroom.
Evening, yes.
This is the first time we've been in the building together, I think, since March. So it's good to almost see you.
Yeah, I was going to say, and you're downstairs and I'm upstairs. And before we get started, I do have to say we were joking. I think that we have had pizza every election night, and are we both going to be, Kevin, with the Home Alone, and we've got our cheese pizza all by ourselves. I mean, it's so different. And
you're
I have
like
to say,
Macaulay Culkin up there.
Yeah, I know.
Be careful.
Exactly, but no, this is still a vibrant newsroom. And you're talking about being alone and just different. The polls were different. I mean, I've been out, I went to two places. I went to Lexington, my polling place, and then I decided to go up to Lowell, do more of a city view. And I did notice a big difference in terms of people who were out and about. There weren't the signs, which I thought was interesting. I really got a sense that a lot of this is happening in the mail. you know, as I said, first stop was Lexington. I talked to all kinds of people there. First person, Dylan Lurvey. I wanted to throw in a bit of the interview I did with him. He was actually a little bit confused, if I could set this up. The polling place was the town hall. And then outside that, in a very congested area, there were 3 boxes. Was the mailbox? Did you drop off your bills? Or did you put in your ballot? No one could figure it out.
Oh, boy.
Backed up cars. People were getting mad there, but the actual voting process wasn't bad.
So this is Dylan Lurvey.
Dylan Lurvey.
Spoke with Mary outside
who was
the
trying to figure out the boxes.
Thought there was a drop box. I'm pretty sure that's it. So I'm looking to do the drop box today. It was actually great. Yesterday I got a call and I was able to get more information about voting, just people calling around. I was planning on dropping my ballot in the mail today, and they informed me that obviously it's upon delivery. That's when it's due. It's not, you know, when it's sent. So I have to do the drop box today. So instead of missing my chance to vote, I figured I'd pop over here and drop it off.
How do you characterize the election? Crazy, interesting? What would you like to say about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of characteristic of the entire year we've had so far, to be honest.
Here. Don't you love talking through a mask on the radio, Mary? Unless you talk
At one point, I was talking to a poll worker, and she was saying, you know, it was people were being very, very cordial, and I thought she was saying provocative, and she says no, cooperative, and we're trying to figure it out. So yeah, so that was one person I spoke with. I also asked him if COVID-19, if that played a role at all.
I would have preferred by mail. I'm stopping by here today, and honestly, when it comes to COVID, like, I don't mind talking to you. You're wearing a mask, you're covering your phone, you seem to be doing a good job.
Wow.
But most people, they don't kind of take those precautions. So I'm nervous to really go out in public. I work remote. I work for a small consultancy in Boston. We do IT work, so I don't ever have to leave my house. I think my inspection sticker is like 3 months out of date. You can quote me on that. So I don't drive enough to even really realize that until I got in the car today.
This guy's got to get his own show.
I know, huh? Linda Dixon spoke with her. She was a poll worker who was very happy to be volunteering. She said it was very smooth inside the polling place, and there were some changes when it comes to the sanitary.
Here's Linda.
And we thought there might be a whole education process. Not at all. Not at all. And we have no checkout. You check in, you vote, you put your ballot in the box, you leave.
Wow,
that's different.
That is different.
And everybody's just, oh, okay.
And they feel safe. It isn't like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I want to be here.
Not at all.
Pens, you know, what am I doing with everything?
Not at all. But I think part of it is we are conveying a sense of comfort and confidence, and everything's fine, and everything is fine. It's quite smooth, and I think people are taking their cue from us.
Makes it sound pretty easy, I have to
Comfort
admit.
and confidence. Yeah, there you go.
Well, I suspect some poll workers and volunteers had some anxiety going into this day, so it's interesting to hear that.
Yeah, no, she said that she had nothing but good things to say about how it was set up, and also about how this is all going to be conducted once the tally comes through. She is predicting that they're going to have all kinds of numbers within an hour or two.
Boy, I hope that's true.
I know.
We're already at about 20%, as you might have heard me mention, and we'll be updating the numbers through the hour here. With what you observed and even experienced yourself today, though, Mary, seemed to be pretty consistent. A mask being offered, sanitizer offered, and no, I voted stickers this time.
No, I voted. And in fact, where I voted, usually you would physically put your ballot in the machine, and here you put it through plexiglass, and they did that. They didn't want the sanitizer on because the machines were so sensitive. I thought it was
wow. Hadn't heard that yet.
Yeah.
You spoke with Tyler Rodriguez as well. I see in Lowell.
Yep. I
got around today a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I decided, you got to see, if there's any difference. There was, if I can say, not so much when it comes to why they voted, who they voted for. It was ironic. I think that Erin and Peter were talking about it. You end up having, if you're going to go for Kennedy or Kerry, on both sides, the U.S. Senate race was the draw. And on the Democratic side, Kerry or Kennedy, it was either because he's been there so long, Markey and Kennedy. Markey would, he's been there so long, he should definitely stay. And other people said he's been there so long, he should go. So those were the two things. But again, the voters are pretty much indicative of what Tyler had to say.
I feel like there's been a lot of things going on lately, and I just think that everyone kind of needs to get in tune and, voice their opinion and kind of vote for what they believe in. So Yeah.
What about COVID? Did that bother you at all, coming out to vote as opposed to mail in?
I mean, it did at first in the first few months, but I mean, recently I've kind of just had to get by. I work in the courts, so I've never really taken a break from COVID. So to say the least, no, it hasn't bothered me that much.
So in person, it doesn't matter if it's that or if it was early voting or mail-in voting. Didn't give that much thought.
Not too much, no. Yeah, I was just like, I know this is where I need to be, and showed up today and put my 2 cents in.
Somehow you find all the easygoing people, Mary Blake. I don't know how you do it. I like the sound of this, though.
Yeah,
People were patient then, for the most part.
People were patient, and as I said, the big draw was Kennedy and Markey. That was the race.
Absolutely fascinating turnout, as we could see numbers, Mary, that we haven't seen in over 20 years, according to Bill Galvin. And again, it could take a minute to count it. While you're here, we should update the numbers. With roughly 20%, as I mentioned, of precincts reporting, the Senate primary is looking pretty close. 52% for Joe Kennedy, 48% for Ed Markey. The Republican side has Kevin O'Connor with 56%, Shiva Ayadurai with 43%. And Richard Neal is leading by a pretty wide margin. Alex Morse in the 1st district. Again, we could be counting votes even when Morning Edition comes on the air tomorrow. I hope that doesn't mean you're working all night, though, Mary.
We'll see.
She's done this long enough. Thank you for being with us, Mary Blake, as always, and for doing such a great job. I'm so happy that you could be part of our special live coverage here on GBH News. It's Massachusetts primary night. My name is Joe Mathieu, and we're broadcasting, of course, live on 89.7 GBH Radio, but on all of our social media streams. And if you're just catching wind of this, you can go right now to the GBH News Facebook page, our Twitter feed, or our YouTube page if you want to effectively join us here in our virtual studio. We've been taking some polls of our own this evening. That's one of the great benefits of doing this, is we kind of zoom together with all of our listeners and have one big conversation. A couple of poll questions have been asked, including please choose the racial or ethnic category you most identify with. Choose as many as apply. Widely, 85% turning out white, 7% black, 3% Asian, other gets 4%. Age ranges are pretty interesting too. Over 65, the wide majority here. And as you get younger, it looks like turnout starts to fall off here. In the mass primary election as well, in terms of voting in person or voting by mail. We're going to talk with David Paleologos next, and this is pretty fascinating as well, because everyone had a choice this time. 68% of our listeners in this chat room right now voted by mail. 23% voted in person at a polling station. So let's get back to our special coverage here and bring in, as I mentioned, David Paleologos. He is the director of the Suffolk University Political Research Center, and in fact joined us in doing some polling in this campaign, and was with us last week with his own poll. One of the last numbers we saw going into this election came from David's polling center. It's great to see you, David, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So you were the one who shocked a lot of people last week. Said, you know what, Ed Markey could be up by double digits. That's the last you saw going into this race. Can you tell us a little more?
Yeah, so we had the race 51 to 41% with a margin of error of 4.4%. So that's a 10-point margin outside the margin of error. I have, while I was on mute, I went to the refrigerator and got an egg so that if I'm wrong, I'll put an egg on my face when you read the results. But the polling data was pretty convincing, actually. You know, when we looked at it, Ed Markey was winning by a sizable margin in the early votes. And his base was very intense. The progressive base was extremely strong. And I think when you see some of the results coming in from the Berkshires and from other areas of the state, you're going to see 20, 25-point margins. Now, how that's going to impact the urban support that Joe Kennedy seems to be showing early will remain to be seen, certainly. But this is a race, you know, that had 700,000 people voting early on. That's unprecedented. And if the polling was right, which showed Ed Markey getting almost 60% of the early votes, he went into election day today with a 100,000 vote cushion, 400,000 to 300,000 if the polling was right, which means that if another 700,000 people vote today or voted today, Kennedy would need just to break even. He would need to win that group 400 to 300,000. So it's possible he does it. Maybe he breaks it 500, 200,000. But I think that's where this race is going to land. And many of the polls had Ed Markey ahead, I think, except for one, which only had at a margin of error race a couple points. But this is why we count all the votes. It remains to be seen what the outcome will be.
Here, here. So I guess no mystery then why Joe Kennedy spent so much time on the road over the last week or two. Fall River, down to Brockton, out to Springfield, up to Lawrence. He was doing 6-7 events a day because those are the cities that could move the needle for him, yes?
Yeah. So and here's the challenge. And all of the cities you just mentioned were cities. He didn't go to suburban areas very much. He didn't go to rural areas very much until actually at the beginning he did, but he really closed where people hadn't voted going into today, which was the urban areas. So that was a very smart move. But the challenge for Joe Kennedy isn't one particular demographic. You know, most campaigns, they go into election day saying, we need this demographic. We've got to pull out everybody that represents this demographic. Joe Kennedy's core demographic was twofold. He needed urban voters, number one, which speaks to where he visited, African Americans, especially in urban areas. But on the other hand, he needed casual voters, many of whom were independents, who liked the Kennedy name, who liked Joe Kennedy, who were disconnected to the political process and who might have been more moderate or right of center. So he had this weird challenge today where Kennedy had to reach in, get out urban voters, and find people who normally don't vote in Democratic primaries and motivate them to get out and vote for him. Whether he succeeds or not, we'll soon see. But that was the two-pronged challenge that he faced.
That's quite a challenge indeed. We've got a question from Anthony, who's watching on YouTube from Maine. And thanks for checking in, Anthony. Curious, the question, David Paleologos, if a really tight result means good news for Joe Kennedy or for Ed Markey. Seems like a blowout, Anthony writes, would be good for Ed Markey.
Yeah, I think a tight race would run counter to what we've all been presenting for poll results. And when I say we, it's not just Suffolk University, it's numerous other public pollsters that you can see on Real Clear Politics or 538.com and private polling. If the race is close, I mean, I think the lowest we will want, maybe a little bit lower than some of the others. There were 5 polls that were released within a 3 or 4 day period. There was a 7-point margin for Markey. We were 10. There were a couple at 12 and one at 15. So that kind of speaks to what the range might be depending on turnout. And but you know, I'm a perfectionist. So I mean, if Markey were to win by 20 or 25, something which I don't think will happen, that's a miss as far as we're concerned. And if it's a tie, like you say, if Markey only won by 1 or 2, then you're outside the margin of error there too. So, and that would run counter to all of the public polling, really.
A couple of questions here, including one. This is just kind of an insider wonky question, but I kind of like it, and I think you will too, David. Abby asks, in our virtual Zoom studio here, does widespread mail-in voting mean the death of exit polling?
It could, because if we took exit polls to heart tonight, that is, we selected key precincts that represent the outcomes in the statewide vote, Kennedy would be leading in those exit polls probably, and would not account for the big lead that Markey banked for the last week and a half, 2 weeks. Because it just wouldn't pick those people up. They're not coming out of the polling place. And so you would get a disproportionate result of a portion of the electorate versus a random sampling of people from a bellwether precinct that would adequately represent that statewide vote. It's a great question.
David, you're out with some new numbers this week, tomorrow, right? Or is it as soon as tomorrow?
Yeah, no rest for the weary. So this is for your studio audience only.
This is great.
We're releasing a national poll tomorrow morning with USA Today on obviously the national ballot test, but we're asking some questions about racial injustice, Trump favorability and job approval, how he fares. We are entering into the mix the presence of third-party candidates And we're asking some jolting questions about COVID-19 that we're holding. We're not going to release those until Thursday, that I think you're going to find really interesting. The entire poll is a must read. So if you're up early tomorrow, be sure to check out USA Today.
It just so happens I will be. Maybe I'll call you. David Paleologos, pollster at Suffolk University. It is the Suffolk Political Research Center. I'm just going to throw this out there and I'll upset all the producers. But if you want to hang on, David, maybe we can just get everybody back in here at the end. So thank you for this great update here. Don't go away, because we want to bring in Adam Riley and Soraya Wintersmith. Now, these, of course, are two of our most prominent political correspondents, and they've been on the trail for months and months and months. You hear the reports on Morning Edition. You hear them throughout the day as they've been traveling with candidates and following campaigns, in Adam's case, even out of the country at one point, since last year. So let's say good evening and welcome to our special coverage, Adam Riley and Soraya Wintersmith. Good evening to both of you. And don't forget to unmute your microphone, because I can't hear you. So let's get into, Adam, if you're with us, you were asking, I think, for an opportunity to weigh in on the Senate race. And before we get into the fourth, I'd love for you both actually to have a chance to do that if you're with us here. Joe Kennedy, of course, and Ed Markey in the throes of this campaign, and you guys were out in the field with them. Adam, much has been said about the Kennedy dynasty, about presumptuousness, about skipping your turn in line in the case of Joe Kennedy. He's put quite a lot on the line here. He's not even running to maintain his old seat. It sounds like we might have lost him.
No,
I'll tell you what.
Here.
Oh, here he is. Hi, Adam. What do you think?
I was just waiting for you to finish that thought. So is your question, if he loses, could he come back? Or are you just noting how much is at stake for him here? Because you're right.
It's more the former. The fact that he stuck his neck out like this, I think, expecting to have an enormous amount of support. He's been actually in the throes of a very personal campaign. There's been an enormous amount of criticism from progressives who said, you know what, we didn't need to do this right now. I was at an Ed Markey campaign last weekend in Dorchester. Rachel Rollins, the district attorney, said, we shouldn't even be having this race right now. We don't have the time and the money. We should be solving problems.
Whether the time and money suck will actually end up hurting Democrats down the road, I think it's an open question. I feel like it's more of a philosophical disagreement than a pragmatic one. Erin got into this a little bit, Erin O'Brien, earlier on in this broadcast. But when you look at previous challenges, Seth Moulton sort of made it legit to challenge incumbents when he ran against John Tierney a few cycles ago and won. In that case, John Tierney had been in office a long time and his wife had some pretty ugly legal problems. Ayanna Pressley ran against Mike Capuano and was able to make the argument, yeah, it's great that Mike Capuano is good on the issues and that we might vote the same way on a lot of legislation, but as she put it again and again, representation matters. Meaning, essentially, I'd be a Black woman representing Massachusetts in Congress. I would do the job differently because of that than Mike Capuano does. I'd have a different sensibility, different approach. Kennedy, I think, has had a harder time articulating a clear rationale for his candidacy. And to my mind, the frustration that you talk about is part and parcel of that struggle that we've seen him go through. It's two white guys running against each other. He makes the sort of fierce urgency of now argument. You know, you need someone who does the job differently than Ed Markey, shows up in the places he represents more than Ed Markey does, pays more attention to issues of race and racial injustice. But it's tough to make that case when demography isn't on your side and when you happen to come from one of the nation's best known political dynasties. I think it's a natural setup for some resentment.
Setup, boy, I'll tell you. What do you think about this, Soraya? And I'd love to know what you've been hearing from voters, frankly, in your coverage, what people are saying in the neighborhoods that you cover. Soraya, if you're not familiar, is also housed in our Dorchester bureau and also speaks with people who are very politically active in that neighborhood, who in some cases say Joe Kennedy did not make the case for why he had to run now, knowing, Soraya, that Markey or Kennedy are going to likely vote the same on a lot of issues.
Yeah, I think Adam makes a really good point about Kennedy struggling to distinguish himself from Markey and how he'd be different. I think in the case of Pressley and Capuano, our Jim Browdy hosted the debate between the two of them, and she made the distinction about how she feels about folks kneeling to protest police brutality, and Capuano said he didn't. And even though they weren't different on issues or policy positions, their perception of protest being acceptable or not acceptable, I think was a signal to voters of color. This is the way that Presley would view policy differently and represent us differently, because she views this protest issue, which we saw later this year become a huge thing for people. She expressed that she viewed that social issue differently. And I think she distinguished herself in that way. Kennedy has not. And I think that just like you heard from Rachel Rollins, I've also heard from progressive folks that now didn't seem like the time, with the focus on the presidency, now didn't seem like the time to challenge an incumbent who really wasn't doing all that bad a job. At the same time, I want to note that Peter made a really great point about cities providing for the surprise element in elections, because again, when you and I and Karen and your morning crew went out to watch both of the Senate candidates out in Dorchester, Kennedy spent a lot of time emphasizing the names of those so-called gateway cities. And city council presidents from, I think, 4 of them ended up endorsing him. I don't know that that will be enough of what he needs to turn out that surprise element, but certainly we're all...
Well, David Paleologos' numbers would back that up. If mail-in voting was less likely in many of the city centers, whether it's Boston or Springfield, Lawrence, Brockton, whatever gateway city you want to choose, then we still have a bunch of votes to count here, Adam Riley.
We do. And I was going back when you were chatting with Peter and Erin at the outset, going back and looking at some of the big takeaways from the various polls that have been done on this race. And in all the recent polling we've seen, Kennedy does better, as David Paleologos mentioned. He does better with independents. He does better with people who do not have a college degree. He does better with people who make less money and with people who are not white. Markey does better with the converse in all those categories, people who are college educated, people who make more money, people who are Democrats, and people who are white. So that's another way to think through Kennedy's focus on the gateway cities, because those are sweet spots for all the sort of people that he tends to beat Markey with.
By the way, we just got an update. The last check, 26% turnout in the city of Boston, and it was as of 6 p.m. And when you add the mail-in ballots to that, these could be some pretty impressive numbers. Now, before we bring David Paleologos and maybe others back, I want to talk to you guys about the 4th district and maybe the future of Joe Kennedy, because if he does not win, he's not going back to Congress. And Adam, as we discussed this morning, there's a very wide field. Soraya, we've got a bunch of names in here. And just as a political reporter, a crowded space, as I'm sure you can speak to here, can make things very confusing. You had 9 candidates on the ballot, 7 of them actually still in the race at the time of voting. I mean, there are people who live in this district who don't even know half of the candidates and who they are.
It seems to be the trend now, though.
Go ahead, Soraya.
My bad.
I just said it seems to be the trend now, though. We saw it on the Republican side in 2016 before we picked Trump, and then we saw it on the Democrat side nationally. So people are having more options.
I guess that's for sure. How do you bubble to the top with such a crowded field, Adam, in a primary?
Well, just for the record, we should acknowledge there's 2 Republicans running too. So you've got 9 Democrats, 2 of whom have now dropped out to endorse one of their former rivals, and then 2 Republicans. It's completely jam-packed. I think endorsements are one way you do it. That was a huge get for Jake Auchincloss when the Boston Globe endorsed him. It also may prove in the long run to have been somewhat detrimental to his campaign, paradoxically, because there was this great hue and cry from people who said, okay, Jake Auchincloss is a former Marine, Newton City Councilor. That's great. He's also a former Republican. He's made some comments on social media in the past that we're not comfortable with. It was after the Globe's endorsement of Auchincloss that you saw 2 of the candidates, Dave Cavell and Chris Zanettos, drop out and say, we're endorsing Jessie Mermel, Deval Patrick's former communications director, who's got this great big long resume in public service, because we want her to be elected instead of Jake Auchincloss. Now, my characterization there suggests it's become a 2-candidate race, and it's not. There's all sorts of other, I feel like I just got to read the names quickly. Ihsan Lecky, who has this amazing story of coming from Morocco, penniless, basically, and becoming a Wall Street regulator. Natalia Linos, who is an epidemiologist at a moment when that's the big issue facing the country. Alan Casey, who co-founded City Year and has run for the U.S. Senate twice. Ben Siegel, who would be the first, I believe, Latino member of Congress. And I can't remember if I mentioned Becky Grossman or not before, but also if she could sneak up and surprise everyone. It is an absolutely jam-packed field.
Yeah, this is going to be interesting to figure out here. And we should note the country's last unsettled open seat primary is really something the eyes of the nation are on Massachusetts for a number of reasons here. You spoke with all of them, Adam, and we salute you for that, because there was not nearly enough reporting in this race.
Well, I tell you, honestly, that was kind of dumb luck, because Jim Browdy happened to be going on vacation and I was keeping his seat warm. But I'm really happy I got to do it. One thing, and Joe, this I think will sound familiar to you, probably you too, Soraya. Sometimes when a race is so packed, I think the media kind of doesn't know how to get at it. How do you do a story about 9 candidates? Well, it's almost impossible. You list their bios and names and you're done with the piece. And that can keep us from diving in. I was really happy we were able to talk to the Dems on Greater Boston.
Well, let's see where we are. By the way, and as I've been saying, we don't even have 20%. We're still below 20% in precincts reporting here. But Auchincloss has 22% right now. Jessie Mermel, 20%, Becky Grossman 17%, and we go on down. These numbers will keep bouncing around.
And incidentally, the Auchincloss and Mermel numbers are similar to what we saw in some of the scant polling that's been done, but that's a great number for Becky Grossman.
Soraya Wintersmith, the issues behind this race, you've already picked through a couple of them. Most of them are national. We've got a pandemic underway right now, a racial justice movement, and generational shifts in politics where the conversation is changing so quickly that I dare say a lot of people over 40 don't even know what anyone's talking about right now. This is a real time of change.
Yeah. I saw a question in our chat box of someone asking what the influence of the Black Lives Matter movement might be for this race. And I think it's pretty...
Is it possible to quantify?
I don't think it's possible to quantify. I do think its influence is hard to ignore, though. We saw both of the candidates in early June introduce bills that have to do with qualified immunity or allowing lawsuits, civil rights lawsuits of police officers. And I feel like that is an immediate and visible reaction to all of the protests that were happening.
People are suddenly, that lexicon means something to people, right? People know what qualified immunity means.
Right.
People know what the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act is, and both of these candidates have been talking a lot about both of them. Let's bring everybody back. We only have about 7 or 8 minutes left here to the hour, and we've certainly had a lot of smart people on board. David Paleologos from Suffolk is with us here, the pollster. And of course, we spent time earlier with Peter Kadzis and Erin O'Brien. So let's just have everybody jump in the pool here as we wait for numbers to start coming in. David, you've been listening to this conversation with Soraya and with Adam. I don't know if you had a chance to run numbers on the 4th district, but this is yet another head scratcher with so many names popping around.
Yeah, you got to wait this one out. You know, a 2% lead is 3 precincts in a particular community away from flipping. So I agree. I think that one could be a late night, and you may have challenges, resulting from that particular race. It looks like Congressman Neal's out to an early lead. Again, you've got to see what precincts have come in there. I never thought that it was a close race. I had privy to some of the polling numbers out there privately. I never believed it was a single-digit race ever in the entire year. But you have this unique trend that's going on right now where you've got young white challengers losing to Massachusetts older white male Catholics who have been in office for a long time. Richard Neal, Billy Galvin 2 years ago, challenged by a good challenger, Josh Sakom. You have Joe Biden in this presidential election, and now Ed Markey. And so it's a really strange counter trend that's going on. And it almost makes one think, is it just persons of color that are the true gladiators that can take out the older white, the older white leaders who have been in office for many, many decades? And maybe that's the new calculus.
Boy, that's a very real question. We touched on that a little bit, Erin O'Brien, when you were on with us earlier. Kennedy Markey is not Presley Capuano. We're constantly reminded on that. So is that the difference?
I think that's part of the difference. And especially, we were just talking about the Black Lives Matter, but I don't think that's it. I mean, it's pretty anecdotal, right? We have Maura Healey, Catherine Clark. And so it's hard to run and win is what this suggests to me in a lot of ways. But I think the ideological battle is really more predictive here. And again, I know I'm repeating myself a bit, but that Senate race is hard to tease apart. We really shouldn't generalize too much from it because it's so much more personality. Adam and I have talked about this. My real take on this race is that both of those candidates have been ill cast for the roles they're now playing. Joe Kennedy, corporate, moderate, Ed Markey, the second coming of Bernie Sanders. Neither of those things are true, but when they're so closely aligned and we know we're going to watch these races, voters have to make sense of them in some way. And what's going on in Democratic politics, I think, was projected onto that race rather than those candidates embody Democratic politics right now.
And Saraya, I noticed you were nodding while she was saying that. Then we'll go to Adam.
I was just agreeing with what she was saying.
But that rings true in terms of their being miscast.
One point I think is important to make when it comes to the Markey Kennedy race, and this may have come up earlier, but it bears emphasizing, even if we touched on it already. Markey's ability to get really young voters passionate about his campaign. If he is able to win a race that people thought he had no chance of winning at the outset, for me, that will be the big story. What was it about Ed Markey that made voters 18 to 29, in some cases, even people who were not old enough to vote, but were going out there on a regular basis, volunteering for his campaign, getting other people to the polls? What was it? What was the secret that made that work for him? And I think just really quickly, he was able to benefit from, I think, a sort of a Bernie Sanders dynamic. We saw Sanders able to appeal to young voters who identified themselves as far to the left, very progressive. So I think he was the beneficiary of that, but his campaign also managed to create a political aesthetic from that ad that we alluded to earlier, where he comes back and turns JFK's words around and says, it's time to start asking what your country can do for you.
Right.
To the pics of him in Malden hanging out in his Air Force One sneakers.
Yeah. Well, let's let Peter Kazis jump in on this. We only have a minute left. And Peter, you also were raising your hand here because I think we're getting warm with a point you were about to make.
Well, I think that it's a simple answer to the question Adam raises. It's the environment. It's concern.
Green New Deal. As opposed to having a young staff that makes great fan videos and sends out clever tweets and gets everybody engaged online.
Can I jump in?
Yes, he's muted anyway. Go for it, Erin.
But I work on a college campus. College students, to Adam's point, are mobilized. The organizational structure was there, and college students are very aware of privilege. That a lot of discussion about privilege, and it's real and it's meaningful. White privilege. And Joe Kennedy, he can't control his last name. He is the embodiment for these young people, for many of them who have been active in Black Lives Matter, who have been active in other social movements, active beyond Bernie Sanders. I think Joe Kennedy was a particularly bad fit for this political moment, where questions of privilege and inherited wealth are all being discussed. He could never break out of that box to both leverage his name, but not leverage his name. You can't do both.
That ring true, Mary Blake, in 30
I
seconds?
just wanted to say that the grand experiment is going to be the type of voting that was conducted during this primary race. How long it's going to take to tabulate them, still to be determined, but it's really going to say a lot of what elections are going to be like to come.
The GBH All-Stars, Mary Blake, Peter Kadzis, Soraya Wintersmith, and Adam Riley. Also, David Paleologos from Suffolk and Erin O'Brien from UMass Boston. I'm so happy that you could all gather with us tonight here to walk us through the Massachusetts primary night. We've got a lot more to follow, including a news update from Mary Blake. And you can find much more on the race at the website, wgbhnews.org. Our special coverage was produced by Karen Marshall. Emmy Schreffler brought us to life on Zoom tonight. Andrew Massow was our engineer. I'm Joe Mathieu. For continuing coverage, stay with us and join us when you wake up tomorrow on GBH's Morning Edition.
Trusted, local news. This is 89.7 WGBH, WGBH HD1 Boston, online at WGBHnews.org. Boston's local NPR.
Live from NPR News.